Well, for a start, Alex Hawkins is an improvising and jazz pianist. Well, we'll come to that. And he lives in Oxford, I believe.
That's right.
Yeah, and he's well known on the British scene, and he's playing this evening at this festival. And I'm going to start asking him a couple of questions, well, some questions about, because he's done solo albums, but actually only fairly recently, well, in fairly recent years. He's done 2 solo albums in 2014 and I think earlier this year or last year. Actually, I just wondered, I mean, for a pianist, playing solo is not so unusual. Presumably you did play solo before, but you just didn't record. You didn't record the results, or maybe not. I don't know.
No, absolutely. I did. I mean, I did play solo before, and I think maybe this goes to an interesting thing is that we're talking a lot about process too, but I'm also interested in the outcome. I think at this point we deal a lot with process, and but also I like the thing to sound good. Not necessarily in any particularly orthodox way, but I did it before and I didn't like what I was hearing, or not enough to inflict it on other people. So, so yeah, the first solo record was released in 2014. I think recorded slightly earlier, and then I felt that, or more precisely, the label thought, and then asked if I agreed that I had maybe had something more to say on it, and we recorded that late last year. But yeah, it's something that you always do because, of course, it shades into practice as well. I mean, when you're sitting at home, putting the hours in, those two behaviours shade into each other. So yeah, something I've always done.
And how would you describe the difference between solo and group improvisation, following something, what Evan Parker was discussing earlier?
Well, I mean, Evan has sort of really shaped a lot of my thinking about the discipline of playing solo. It is interesting because you don't really have nearly so many of these external inputs, of course. Yes, there's the room. Also, with the piano, there's the instruments as well. One of the things about it is, as instruments go, our range of kind of extended techniques is on the piano is maybe not as large as on some instruments. There are fewer ways to subvert the instrument, at least with the speed of execution, which makes it an interesting thing to do on a regular basis. And so as a result, I think you quite often rely on the instrument being a very good instrument in an orthodox sense in order to find interesting things. So the harmonics, the quality of the action, and so on and so forth. So, but yes, other than these variables, the instruments, the room, solo is an interesting thing because you're generating most of the input. Of course, you can broaden that out because there are memories, there are your influences, the people you've listened to, the people you've talked to about it, and they play somewhere in the, if not in real time in your mind when you're improvising, but in the preparatory stages to improvising. So there are external inputs, but of course they're not nearly so explicit as in a group context. Then you move into the interesting situation where, when you're in the group context, you have all these other inputs, and so I think one of the interesting things to do is to avoid the obvious modes of interacting with those inputs. I mean, for example, we've all heard free improvisation where imitation can be something of a drag, or maybe I should say imitation is an interesting thing, but you want to find the interesting parameter to imitate. After a while, when you get good ears, you can play someone's stuff back at them. That's maybe not so interesting. So actually, you have all these different inputs in a group setting, and the skill then perhaps becomes knowing, if not when to ignore what you're hearing, at least how to process all those extra inputs.
Are you aware of having different identities as a jazz player and a free improviser? Presumably you describe. You're happy to describe yourself as a jazz player and a free improviser, or maybe not.
Well,
or maybe these are just critical labels that are...
Yeah, they're critical labels. I mean, for example, I'm very self-conscious about the jazz label. I mean, it's the music that I sort of deeply love and I've grown up with, but at various times in the history, maybe more than not, it also has a deeply conservative strand associated with it. Let's not pretend that it's all radical. In fact, let's not all pretend that it's all improvised behaviour too, because one of the problems is that improvisation is incredibly rule-bound and norm-bound and routine-bound. Well, in free improvisation too. You know, when people muscle memory is a powerful thing for the instrumentalist. But also, sorry, to go back to the question, actually, so jazz is a label. If it's applied by someone whose love of the idiom, the sound world, I trust, then yes, I'm very happy and I'm proud to be grouped in that way. Insofar as it connotes this kind of slightly macho, higher, faster, louder game, then I'm not in. But do I think differently? No. I mean, I think one of the nice things that improvisation, of course, allows you to do is interact with people in a lot of different contexts, and obviously where you don't share verbal languages. And for me, jazz is just one set of norms which might be more in play when interacting with a certain group of people. Or to put it another way, I'm also open to the fact that it's nice to get together with a bunch of people and say, what happens if we play with harmonic, predetermined harmonies or rhythmic formulae. I don't necessarily behave differently, other than that there are certain musical parameters which you have to honour to make it worthwhile doing it. But the same is also true if I play with, for example, anyone. I mean, musicians from any other culture. I mean, an Ethiopian musician or a Sudanese musician, there are certain parameters which you might want to have in mind in order to make that a worthwhile thing to be doing. Although another thing, of course, is that there are improvised settings where it's also totally fascinating just to hear people coexisting in the same time space doing their thing. I think of, for example, Evan talked about musicians of the AACM. A really fascinating thing for me is to listen to the trumpeter Wadada Leo Smith play duets with drummers, because there's this incredible record with the great Ed Blackwell, where basically they just do what they do. There's not this, or there is interaction between Blackwell's left hand and what Wadada's playing, but basically they just do what they do, they're just coexisting. But it's this togetherness in this really wonderful sense. If someone says to me, what did I do last week? I was at home, I spent the weekend with my girlfriend, but she was sitting reading a book, I was dealing with emails, my cats were going nuts. But we spent it together, so it's common enterprise. Now, if I'm listening to Earth, Wind and Fire, I want that to be literal togetherness. I want Earth, Wind and Fire, we need to be capturing the one-e and a two-e and, we need to be on those. But other things not so much. And so there are these different types of togetherness.
That's not a very common picture of group improvisation, that each musician is existing in their own space. I think of, for example, Stan Getz is supposed to be an example of somebody who improvised, and the band was a backdrop, and he wasn't getting much from them or giving anything to them, because he wasn't very interested in what they were doing, except for them providing a brilliant setting for his own brilliant work.
He had very good taste, though, didn't he?
Oh, he had great taste with his band. Yeah. He knew who provided great setting. But maybe I'm doing him a disservice, but that's the kind of reputation he had anyway. And that's considered in some ways not totally satisfactory, or maybe part of the entertainment business, but you're suggesting that can be an interesting way to approach improvisation.
It can. I think it can be. I'm just saying it's one possible mode of proceeding, and it happens to. I suppose I was talking in the context of duos, where it can be a particularly.
Can I just interrupt, because that was the point of introducing the talking about AACN, and it's a relatively recent realization for me, especially in the age of electronic processing, and as a consequence of knowing George Lewis and knowing Voyager and knowing all, knowing the way the mindset, the Chicago mindset works, and Roscoe, having played quite a bit with Roscoe Mitchell over the last few years, I suddenly realized there is a third way, which is not atomistic, it's not, or a fourth way, so, it goes beyond music improvisation, company synthesis of the atomistic and the laminar. Streaming is apparently, you could say that's a form of laminar playing, but streaming, the mindset behind streaming is exactly the way you've described it, that you maintain something, an identity, in the same way that you're in a room with your girlfriend. You're doing different things, but you're maintaining your identities, and it works perfectly well. And so thanks for
I think it ties to Braxton in his he wrote this kind of really interesting, quite dense, but this incredible philosophical treatise about his music. He called it the Triaxiom Writings. But he talks about these different modes of behaviour, and talks about basically composition, improvisation, but also the decision as to when to introduce the composed material. And so, in a sense, it's an improvised decision suddenly to shut down to all the outside impulses, or just to do the same, to repeat the same idea. And yeah, Roscoe is a master at this kind of bloody mindedness. And in a group context, it can force other people to do very interesting things, I think.
That leads us naturally on to the question whether you could explain to the uninitiated, and presumably you agree with what Evan Parker was saying, that improvisation is a form of composition, and actually Tony Buck agrees with that too. He said that. But to most people that would be, think, what does that mean? And maybe you could explain? I mean, I think it means means several things actually, but maybe you could.
Well,
unless, or maybe you don't agree.
I do agree that they seem to belong on a continuum. Of course, you have more predetermined and less predetermined things. The first thing I'd say is that, again, going back to my thing, that often when people say they're improvising, so we talked about talking about music and this being an important part of doing music and being musicians and actually being a community, being together, talking about things. But of course, musicians also, just like all of us, are also fronting at some point. So what people say they do is not necessarily what they actually do, and it's also what they think. It was late flight.
What they think they ought to.
What they think they ought to be doing. And anyway, sorry. So much to say that often when people say they're improvising, maybe not so much. Going back to say muscle memory being a powerful thing, there are certain norms. People, you maybe hear people fulfill roles. Sometimes musicians with reputations, maybe there's an so there are all these things going on as well. But you could talk about these practice, these things which solidify in practice as compositional traits. One of the things which I think is interesting is Evan. One of the things that was really influential on me was early on was hearing an interview with Evan where he talked about this idea of trying to force the error, force something to happen, and then being open enough to grab that moment and try and gather that in, try and find what went wrong, and try and grab it and then work with that. And that was hugely influential to me, especially somebody who came up through playing orthodox classical music, where control can be a kind of tyranny too. It can also be the most thrilling thing, but and that realization was very interesting to me. That forcing the error and seeing where that can take you. But there's also a sense in which one of the things I love about improvisation is how precarious it is, because to do it well, I think, is extraordinarily difficult. But it's beautiful how kind of It's precarious because you can do it okay with not so much effort, actually, you know? And that to me is because it forces a kind of honesty, a kind of integrity to try, really to be focused on doing the best you can in the situation. Now, one of the things which I really respect about composers more and more, also authors, is there's a certain bravery involved in that, because people, like to romanticize. Jazz musicians definitely like to romanticize themselves. Get up, blow your heart out. It's always your heart before your mind, but that's in there too. And there's this kind of mystery, as we talked about, of what comes out. But a certain amount of technical proficiency and oral proficiency, you can do that. I kind of really love the bravery of the composer who at some point hands the score to the publisher and says, this is it. Even if that is a score where you're deliberately surrendering certain elements of control. There's a point at which you're like, there it is. And that's a kind of bravery which I really admire, because as improvisers, we do also work to be able to grab the mistake and make it, incorporate it. And so, I'm not really answering the question, but it's proceeding like an improvisation, isn't it? I've taken, that's been my starting point.
I was going to suggest that there's two senses of composition. There's a sense of, when you think of a composer, you think of somebody producing a score, usually at a desk, or maybe a piano. But I think composition in all the arts means putting things together in a pleasing way. And I think I would suggest that's the sense in which improvisation is a method of composition. It's not a method of composition because the word composer has been hijacked by, it's not hijacked, but it's been appropriated by this particular recent method in the West, which is quite unusual in the history of music. That's why people are saying Derek Bailey's comment about improvisation being, misunderstood and yet very widespread, the most widespread form of music making. So I was thinking maybe that's what it means to say, if you're saying improvisation is a method of composition, you're using composition, you're trying to change the orthodox sense in which that term is used. But that's just a suggestion, I may be wrong.
Yeah, so going back to, again, ASCM, so Anthony Braxton, because, exactly, how we define these behaviours is interesting. So Braxton tells this lovely story about playing solo, and this will then relate to composition. But in the early days, or no, maybe still actually, to become a member of the AACM, you had to give a solo recital. This was part of your initiation, if you like. And Braxton tells this story of he gets up and he plays 10 minutes of, as he describes it, just flowing. He plays everything and it's going great. And then after 10 minutes, he's like, I've played all my stuff, What do I do for the next 50 minutes? And so there's this crisis of how do I do it? How do I proceed? How do I actually improvise? Because it's not it has this, there is of course a mysterious element to it, but you can also prepare to improvise. And then you have this crisis point 10 minutes in where it's like, what do I do now? And so his response was to do it a lot and to listen to what he was doing and to try to distill elements of his language. So he isolated, for example, long tones, slap tone, trilling, various contour shapes. Initially, he came up with a big range of these things, but now it exists at roughly 12 what he calls language types. And so really he now he would say he never free improvises, but instead what he does is he has in mind certain of these language shapes, language music types, to act as the springboard for his improvisation. Now, is that improvised or is it composed? Maybe it's not that interesting to think of it that way. It's very, very self-aware. It's very honest that it's not some heroic pursuit of just plucking the inspiration out of the air when you're improvising. And of course, from there, just as when Evan played the first example on the soprano and stopped himself because the music had wandered beyond the initial point that he was hoping to demonstrate with the air column. These things are all springboards. And so this, I think, is interesting when you think about the question of practice and being conscious. So for me, practice at the instrument is a super rational exercise. I mean, I'm a sucker for playing etudes and or just very technical things, because my aim is to get the very deliberate, very technical aspects of music as solid as possible, so that I can get to that space quicker where I'm not thinking about what I'm doing. Which is why, talking about improvisation is difficult, because I think when we're not really thinking in a super conscious way when we do it. Or maybe you might have flashes where you'll suddenly come back down to earth and think, let me just grab that thing that Evan played and turn it upside down. Maybe there are these moments, but a lot of it isn't a conscious activity. So for me, I work very hard on the conscious aspect in order that I can get to that space much quicker during performance where I'm not thinking, I think.
I think at this point we should open for questions. So anyone got any questions?
Well, I'll just take up your last point when we get to it's a subconscious thing that comes for an expert such as yourself. It comes when you've got that mastery. It can also, as the speaker said, the power trick when you also don't know what you're doing. That's not a question.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I remember the very brilliant drummer that actually I have to thank Evan for the introduction, Tony Marsh. And I remember going to Tony's house in London.
No, Tony introduced me to you.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
No, Lewis?
Yeah.
Did he?
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. I'm trying to rewrite it here. Okay, so it was this way. Okay. So I went to Tony's house in London, and he said, oh, listen to this. This is this amazing. Listen to this piano playing. Tell me what you think. And he put on this CD, and I was like, wow, what is this? And I couldn't recognize it. If it was a blindfold test, I'd been stumped. But I thought, oh, maybe it's not Alex Schlittenbach, and it's not Irene Schweitz, and Tony meanwhile was getting happier and happier with this whole situation. And after about sort of 10 minutes of tortured guessing on my part, where I'd named virtually every kind of great European pianist that could come to mind, he said, no, these are my two guitarist mates playing pianos in different rooms of a concert hall, which are linked purely by, they couldn't hear each other. So what you're hearing is two pianos played by non-pianists. I didn't even spot it was two pianos. There I was looking for a human being who could play the piano with two hands. But yeah, so I suppose the thing being that I suppose I was proud of myself in that I listened to the outcome. I thought, well, this is interesting. I took it at face value. But then it was a parlor trick in the sense that it wasn't the product of any great conscious, restructuralist piano playing. Yeah. So absolutely, and this goes back to maybe where we started. That the outcome is also, the process is super interesting, but in the end, I also like to hear something that, whether it provokes me, moves me, or something, the outcome is also interesting to me. Cool.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I think that also sort of relates back to something you were talking about earlier, about duo situation with the musicians each going apparently their own way. Because while you were talking about that, I was thinking, well, as a listener, not as a musician myself, but as a listener, of many years duration, I think one does have a certain way of listening to improvised music. But a situation where the two people are doing something largely independent of each other actually creates an additional problem or a new experience for the listener as well. But what you were just saying there about the two pianists in different rooms suggests almost as a listener, you have in that case unconsciously almost synthesized those two things into a whole which you as the listener have created.
Yeah.
From the independent things that the musicians are doing. I mean, does that seem I'm trying to get my head around how one would listen to that sort of music where there are independent things happening, possibly with no conscious relationship to each other.
Yeah, I don't know. I think there's lots of different ways of listening to it. I mean, it doesn't quite answer that question, but one of the musical structures which has just fascinated me the most in recent years has been Braxton's echo mirror house music. And so this is a music where effectively it's a group of acoustic musicians, but each of those musicians also. So Braxton became very interested in collaging his own works on top of each other and creating sort of collage forms in this way. And in the echo mirror house music, each of the acoustic musicians also has a sort of an electronic setup where they're able to play excerpts from Braxton's back catalogue or whatever. So you get, the point being, you get this incredibly dense musical, sort of three-dimensional musical environment. And one of the things that Braxton talks about is the different ways that you can exist in this environment. So you can sort of just let yourself be overwhelmed by it, much in the same way as if you were listening to a long piece of Feldman. You maybe just let it happen to you, or an immersive, an installation type thing. Or you can listen to the whole hour and try to take it in as a single musical architecture. Or I can say to myself, okay, well, I can't process all this, but I'm really interested in what Jessica Pavone is playing at this moment. So I'm going to walk through this maze and listen to the viola. I also had this experience hearing Evans' electroacoustic ensemble live, where there's this incredible sort of constellation of activity. It's like a sort of a cathedral. It's almost too much to take in at once, but you can sort of get inside and listen and fix in on different points. I don't know, it's a different way of listening, but
I think this is the last question.
This isn't actually the question. I'm going to follow up on what you're saying. Because sometimes if you're walking down a street, you're aware of different sounds going around. Sometimes you can take it in as a whole, but you're in a way required to focus. I mean, which is something our ears do naturally, isn't it? Just focus on it. And in a way, it's a little bit like that. If you've got different performers all performing their own thing, that's the choice you make. How much of it, or how much of each particular angle you take in.
Yeah.
Back to my question.
Yeah.
Which is to do with what I see a lot of improvisation being is augmenting something that already exists, and that can be from when just that moment a performance starts. Something exists, and therefore people sort of put that. And it was very interesting to listen to you saying, that when you practice that you're putting many forms and putting a language into and a vocabulary into your. Do you ever, as a performer, completely empty your mind? Do you ever go onto a stage and deliberately just completely empty your mind, and then have a moment where you think, right, there's something going to come in here?
I'm not sure I'd know how to do that. To empty my mind in that way. For me, yeah. So the basic answer being no. It would be a really interesting thing to do, but I actually just don't know how I would go in that state of going on with no information in my mind. On a more practical level, I feel like if my brain were a supercomputer, maybe I'd have more faith in my ability to do this. But I feel that I can take bigger risks with a small kernel of information just in my mind, something to start with. I can get to the business of play quicker, rather than go looking for the idea and then deal with it. Obviously, that's slightly crude. It's maybe not quite as simple as that. But that's my take on it. Also, what I would say in terms of that linear, this is actually just in terms of your first observation, just all these things going on at the same time. We think of this of course, in Charles Ives, in Stockhausen, Duke Ellington, Harlem Air Shaft. there are these two pieces of Ellington which obsess me because of this very thing. All both done in the early 40s. The tune Harlem Air Shaft, where he does this, and also a small group session from 3rd of July 1941 with Rex Stewart, and there's a tune called Menelik, the Lion of Judah, where you've got all these different things going on at the same time, and he somehow magically compresses it into this 3-minute, ostensibly linear score. It's absolute genius, but that's not even a response, it's just a comment on that. Yeah.
Okay, I think we should thank Alex very much.